We'd like to welcome you. Good evening. My name is Phil Wiswer. I am the co-president of the Shalom Club. And on behalf of the board of directors and my co-president, Hal Rappaport, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's special program. The Shalom Club, let me take off a mask, it'll make it a little easier so we can hear me. The Shalom Club is a social and cultural registered Sun City club, which encourages the understanding among the members of all faiths of Sun City. The Shalom Club meets on the second Wednesday of each month from September until June. In spite of the COVID pandemic, we have been very fortunate to have monthly meetings that have ranged from entertainment to speakers. Before the pandemic, we were very fortunate that we had outside activities ranging from dinners to trips of interest. We hope that in the fall, we will be able to continue these programmings for the members. Our board of directors meets every month looking out for interesting things to do and looking at COVID. At this time, I'd like to recognize the board of directors. Any of the board of directors here, could you stand up to be recognized? I'd also like to acknowledge the following guests that we have here tonight. Alicia Koch, who's the club coordinator for Sun City for all clubs. And Lifestyles has been extremely supportive of Shalom Club activities, and particularly this event. They've been very involved with our candle lighting program that we had. And we want to acknowledge the great working relationship we have with this particular. Could Alicia stand up and get recognized? There she is. Also, we are very fortunate that we have Harry Williams, who's the mayor of Hardyville, as our guest tonight. If you would stand up and be recognized. Now, at this time, I'd like to ask Joe Bitterman to come up and to introduce tonight's program and our speakers. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Good evening and welcome. My name is Joel Bitterman. I'm a Sun City resident and a member of the Shalom Club and its board of directors. I want to welcome you to what we believe will be a very special program this evening. The program has been in the works for over 1 year. We owe special thanks to the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust for their willingness and enthusiasm in coming down to our Sun City community. The Shalom Club board of directors for their enthusiastic support of tonight's program, our volunteers from the Sun City Computer Club for their technical expertise, Sun City management, and lifestyle services, in particular for recognizing the value that tonight's presentation adds to our community members. Also want to recognize and thank Harry Williams, Mayor of Hardyville, for your attendance tonight as well. The South Carolina Council on the Holocaust was established in 1989 through a state legislative mandate. It operates in collaborative partnership with the state legislature and the South Carolina Department of Education to promote awareness about the Holocaust and to honor the survivors and concentration camp liberators who call South Carolina home. I would like to now introduce our speakers, Scott Ospelmeyer and Professor Jeff Ergel. Both speakers have impressive credentials. Scott taught high school social studies for 19 years before taking the position of executive director of the council. During this time as a teacher, Scott participated in numerous Holocaust-related teacher trainings in South Carolina and throughout the United States. He also earned the title of Museum Teacher Fellow from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and was also recognized as a Jewish Foundation for the Righteous Learner Fellow. Additionally, before and since becoming the executive director of the council, Scott has led several workshops and teacher trainings on the Holocaust in South Carolina and throughout the United States. Professor Jeff Ergel is clinical professor, assistant professor in secondary humanities education, instruction, and teacher education at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. A national board certified teacher, Jeff has taught all levels of U.S. history, world history, geography, and the Holocaust. We ask that you please hold your questions as there will be time for Q&A and audience talkback at the end of the program. When that occurs, we are probably going to ask those of you with questions to line up to my right. We'll have a microphone so that you can ask your questions of our speakers. And for those of you that are viewing this program via live stream, you'll be able to pose questions as well. Thank you for your attention. With that, I'll turn it over to our speakers. You guys have the presentation up?
Thank you so much. On behalf of the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust, thanks especially to the Shalom Club, to Joel and Phil for all the assistance and for reaching out to us last fall to have this program tonight. We are very happy to be here. Why remember the Holocaust? There are a few reasons that come to mind for a lot of people, but for me in particular, these are the three major reasons that I think of. To honor the victims, to remember our humanity, and as a call to conscience. If we held 1 minute of silence for every Jewish victim of the Holocaust, we would be silent for more than 11 years. That statistic alone is enough for everybody to pause and think and really understand the enormity of this event. When we think about honoring the victims, we certainly think about the 6 million Jewish victims who passed with this event. We also think that because it happened, that we need to understand. We need to understand the evil that led to the unprecedented level of killing and mass murder. We need to understand the complicity and the participation of thousands of ordinary men in the events of the Holocaust and leading to the events of things like the killing centers at Auschwitz. We must also understand the circumstances of the victims. Those who faced the unimaginable with the realization that they could do very little to stop it. Those who, despite their powerlessness, had the courage to resist in a variety of ways. And those who also survived, despite all the odds that were against them. When we think about remembering our humanity and the bravery of the lives of and the deaths of victims, we remember our common connections to one another. While so many died, we must also recognize that in spite of these horrific circumstances, so many survived. How is that? What can we learn from them? And what can we learn from their resilience? We must remember that while there were perpetrators and victims, there were also rescuers and liberators, those who risked their lives or worked to save others whom they had no other connection to, other than that they were also human. People like Raoul Wallenberg, people like Oskar Schindler, groups like the Kindertransport, others like John Paley at the War Refugee Board in the United States, and Jan Karski, a Polish diplomat. And finally, we also remember this as a call to our conscience. In particular, how can we, living in the present, live up to the ideals of the upstanders of that time? What can we do? We must recognize the fragility of our democracy. In 1933, Germany, let's remember, was a democracy. Our political adversaries today need not become our enemies. Our goals need to be committed to preserving democracy and all of its ideals. We need to also respect our humanity. Violence must not be permitted, and civil liberties must be respected. We must have a determination to insist on decency and kindness for all personal interactions. These are some simple things that we can do in our daily lives. We must remember this as a call to our conscience. When we think about Holocaust awareness, since the war, there are many different things that stand out to us, certainly events that have happened since then, and in particular, remembrances like the commemoration we're having tonight. But also, we need to think back to that time period of the war. Anti-Semitism of the World War II era was very present in the United States. If we think about this public opinion poll from July of 1938? What is your attitude towards allowing German, Austrian, and other political refugees to come into the United States? This is before mass killing had taken place on a wider scale. And 67.4%, as you see there, are hesitant. We can admit them with conditions, but overall, we should try to keep them out. And then we see in November of 1938, after Kristallnacht, another poll was conducted. Do you approve or disapprove of the Nazis' treatment of Jews in Germany? News of the Kristallnacht events of earlier that month had spread throughout the world. People were very aware of this. So 94% disapproved in the United States. But also in that same poll, should we allow a large number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? 71% say no. So we were aghast at what was happening, but at the same time, reluctant to really help. Since World War II, we can look a little deeper and more longer terms. Percentage of Americans who agreed with 6 or more of the anti-Semitic index questions. This is a poll done by the Anti-Defamation League. And as you see, less than almost 20 years, 1964, almost 20 years after the end of World War II, Americans surveyed, almost 30% harbored anti-Semitic opinions. One sample question from this, do you agree or disagree that Jews have too much power in business? So those were kind of some of the sample ideas of the questions that they would face. And as you can tell, things have diminished since then in terms of anti-Semitism as far as polling is concerned. But there's still certainly a lot of work to be done. Also, when we think about Holocaust awareness, we think what in the popular realm has been done about the Holocaust. Formally, Dr. Ergel will talk about education in regards to the Holocaust in a moment. But in terms of regular society, outside of Jewish communities in the United States, most of their opinions about the Holocaust or understanding the Holocaust was framed by particular popular events or media. In the early 1950s, it was the Diary of Anne Frank, which is still obviously very prominent today. It was released as English version was released in 1952, followed by the play in 1955, and then the film in 1959. The play and the film, however, sanitized the diary. They play down the Jewish character of the people in the book and the victims as a whole, and they generally avoid discussing the wider horrors of the Holocaust. In 1961, things become a little bit more present to those outside of Jewish communities in the United States with the Adolf Eichmann trial, which obviously gained a lot of attention as well. In the Eichmann trial, you see that the stories of survivors start to become the focal point of this trial, less so than Eichmann himself. And thus the survivors had moved from the status of victims who survived the Holocaust to that of the bearers of history. And so the telling of the stories starts to become more commonplace at this time. In 1978, a groundbreaking miniseries on television came out called Holocaust, simply Holocaust as the title. Many of you may remember watching that particular series. It was a media event of national proportions. There were 220 million people approximately living in America in 1978. Over 120 million saw this series on television. So very impactful to say the least. The American Jewish Committee actually conducted a poll, and over 60% of Americans believe the film helped them more fully understand the Holocaust. And it also prompted more survivors to start telling their stories. As we move closer to the present day, another major media milestone in terms of the Holocaust was Schindler's List, released in 1993. Even critics of the film, such as Peter Novick, who often had a distaste for choosing to tell a heroic savior story, which was obviously a rarity in the reality of the Holocaust, he still remarked, "This film leaves viewers overwhelmed by the horrors of the events and deeply moved as a result." During that same year, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened along the Washington Mall. The fact that it's located on the Washington Mall indicates that it is an event that did not occur, even though it is an event that did not occur in the United States and did not involve Americans as victims or perpetrators. It is worthy of such prominence because it is an event that runs contrary to American principles. Principles that the US was reluctant at that time to extend to other peoples while the event was happening. Recently, if you've been made aware of this, I'm not sure, but in the past over about a year or so, there have been two significant surveys that have been released to the media, one of which has gained more prominence than the other. And that's the first one I'm going to talk about is that very one. This is the Claims Conference survey. The Claims Conference is more formally titled Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. There were 1,350 participants in America polled for this particular survey. Almost half could not name a single concentration camp or killing center. However, let's also remember that if we look at other polling of simple American history topics, including how many branches of government are there, that polling also indicates some similarly disturbing numbers. Not to make light of it, but sometimes we get a little bit too aghast initially. But that still is a disturbing number, no less. The poll also indicated, however, that a majority, 58% actually, believe something like the Holocaust could happen again. And more than 90%, however, believe that the Holocaust should be taught in schools. A different survey that didn't receive quite as much press was done by Echoes and Reflections, which is a partnership between Yad Vashem, the USC Shoah Foundation, and the Anti-Defamation League. This polled 1,500 college students and focused less on content knowledge than the impact of Holocaust education, or if the particular participants had any formal Holocaust education. In comparison to students without formal Holocaust education, students with formal Holocaust education are open to differing viewpoints, more tolerant of others, more able to work cooperatively with others of diverse backgrounds, and understand the importance of speaking up against any stereotyping they witness. So this particular survey really showed the value that Holocaust education holds. So with a brief backdrop there of what's happened in America since World War II, and now we will look a little bit deeper into Holocaust education, specifically past and present.
Arranging our masks, signs of the time, right? So good evening, my name is Jeff Ergel. I'm a faculty member at the University of South Carolina. Listening to Mr. Ospelmeyer speak, I was reminded of a student that I had. I taught a Holocaust course for 7 years at a rural school here in South Carolina, Mid-Carolina, up in Newberry County. And I was reminded of a student, Michaela. And I would end the course and with questions of what have you learned? And Michaela thought, and she said, before this class, I thought I was a good person. I thought I did everything right. I can do much better. You know, that's a powerful, I think a powerful statement, as is this statement from Dr. Milner. Dr. Milner is a professor at Vanderbilt University. He is also a South Carolina State University Bulldog. Graduated from SC State with his bachelor's degree and his master's degree. So he is, we will claim him as a South Carolinian, right? Dr. Milner has a quote here that I feel also captures my philosophy as an education professor, as a former high school teacher, and I think something that drove my portion of the presentation here. For many students, the tough social topics are the curriculum of their lives. That's powerful, the curriculum of their lives. As I think about what is the curriculum of our kids' lives, think of the last year. COVID is part of the curriculum of their life. George Floyd, curriculum of their life. The events on January 6th at the Capitol, forming the curriculum of their life. And what Milner is pointing us to here is we can't avoid not bringing that into the classroom. And he's making this call to us because when we look at education today, we see among teachers a fear of bringing in something too political. In fact, we had this conversation at dinner tonight. That fear that if I bring in something too political, am I going to lose my job? Right? Teachers are also overwhelmed with standards, standardized testing, pacing guides. And if you're unfamiliar with pacing guides, it's something their district gives them that says, you need to teach this standard on this day. So now, those of us who I think are efficient at our jobs, we say, well, that's a nice document, but I'm going to go do what I need to do for my kids, right? I start off with that because I think about this event in Florida here in the last 2 years. So if you're not familiar with it, this is a principal in Boca Raton, Florida. A parent was questioning him, what is the Holocaust curriculum? And this is the text of the email. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he responds to the parent. Not everyone in our community believes the Holocaust happened. And therefore, now I'm going to paraphrase, and therefore, as a public school employee, I have to remain neutral on that. And therefore, I'm going to point this one out right here. I can't say the Holocaust is a factual event. He was subsequently fired. He managed to get his position back because he was able to argue that indeed not everyone in the community believes the Holocaust took place. The district had to rehire him, and then they found him negligent in his duties and they fired him again, right? So, which is the story here. I think though that this particular event speaks to the importance of Holocaust education. And so I want to take now two paths. So I'm going to take a little path for a few slides, and I'm going to come back, I'm going to take another path, and then I'll merge them at the end. And those two paths are to talk about the history of Holocaust education, and then current Holocaust denial, and how those two merge. Not to support Holocaust denial. So I start with this textbook. My presentation here in terms of education. I start with this textbook. I received this textbook in 1999. And so it was used by American high schools and used by high school students, and I'm going to presume 1998. It was published in 1986, okay, 1986. And what you're looking at is the complete telling of the Holocaust according to this textbook, okay? There are a number of things here, and for those of you in the back, I will read the 3 sentences connected to the Holocaust, or explaining the Holocaust. As they went, they meaning American soldiers, as they went east of the Rhine, they liberated the concentration camps at which the Nazis had murdered about 12 million civilians, including 6 million Jews. The mass murder of European Jews became known as the Holocaust. The Nazis had carried out a policy of genocide or racial destruction against the Jews. There's a number of things here that are problematic. The first is it's 3 sentences, right? And rest assured, if we were to look at a U.S. history textbook today, it is far more than 3 sentences. And a world history is even more, several pages. There are other things that I find problematic. There is nothing really here related to anti-Semitism as a cause, right? Nothing really related to anything explaining how and what exactly happened other than camps existed. And the other thing that is problematic, and bear in mind, this is from 35 years ago, the definition of genocide, a racial destruction. and Jews not a race, right? And yet here it is in our textbooks. Now, I've used this with students to point to the problems. I will also say, if we were to look at slavery in this textbook, well, we don't have time to really look at slavery in this textbook, but it is defined as a peculiar institution, and all great countries had it at some point. Okay, so there are a number of problems here in the book that we would not ascribe to today. But I think if we were to put this textbook in some sort of context, we may understand why the portrayal of the Holocaust exists in that manner. So I'm going to go back to 1950. Mr. Osmelmeyer did a great job of capturing our understanding, our country's understanding of the Holocaust since World War II. I'm going to start in the 1950s. And if we were to take a look in general at what was going on with Holocaust education during that time, what we would see is that the Holocaust itself was not necessarily taught in schools through the 50s and 60s. If anything, it was addressed more along the lines of refugees coming to the United States following liberation of the camps, or in relation to war crimes, just as the Eichmann trial that Mr. Osmelmeyer mentioned earlier. And so it's not formally taught and named quite often. What we do see is that within Jewish communities, the Holocaust begins to be taught certainly by the 60s. And in my mind, I'm thinking it's the children of survivors who are being taught this, right? And as we enter the 1970s, following the civil rights movement, the Holocaust becomes more defined as a topic to be taught in our school system, but it's often couched within overall curriculum related to anti-prejudice education or human rights curriculum, right? Now, I would also contextualize that as in the 1970s, schools were leaning toward what they called the new social studies, where you wouldn't take necessarily a US history class or a world history class. It may be something like human rights, and you're looking at all different topics related to human rights. So it was a different time there. I'm going to put 1980 as a turning point, probably somewhat, and we didn't necessarily coordinate, but our presentations lined up nicely. In the wake of the mini-series, the Holocaust, we then see the commissioning of a presidential report, the American Youth and the Holocaust. The findings of the report are fascinating, and it is basically this: kids are interested in the topic, and they know something about the topic, but teachers aren't teaching it. Okay, they're familiar, but teachers aren't teaching it. Okay, that serves, at least from my perspective as in terms of education, that's a shift. Okay, but it's within this larger emphasis on hearing survivors and so forth. But what we see going into the late 80s, the development of Holocaust education centers, committees, councils like the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust. By the 80s, we would see the Holocaust Museum being commissioned, ultimately opened in 1993. So there's a movement going into the late 80s, early 90s with these types of organizations that are out there to bring more knowledge about the Holocaust and professional development to teachers. What we see by the late 1990s is the inclusion of the Holocaust in state standards, okay? And the standards movement coming roughly in the late 90s and filtering across the country. We would have had it, as far as I can see here in South Carolina, with the 2005 standards, clearly articulated with that content. The two takeaways from this here at the bottom that I think are important and linger within how teachers approach it today, the topic of the Holocaust. In the 80s, the focus tended to be, if I teach this with kids, I want to elicit a powerful emotional response, because if they have that emotional response, it will cause them not to engage in perpetrator activity. By the 90s, we begin to see more curriculum designed around, here's what took place at camps, and in ghettos. Okay, so the how and what of the Jewish experience in ghettos and in camps. I would say that those linger today. The first one, related to emotional response, can be a challenge because we do see kids oftentimes today not as emotionally charged by some things. And so my fear is that teachers then overcompensate and try to do something even more drastic in the classroom, and that will ultimately get them on, frankly, it will get them on the news, right, in a negative way. And the blowback from that could be quite troublesome. So we'll put a pin in that for just a moment and think about who's engaged in Holocaust education today. And I've divided this into two parts, or two columns here. The first is rather linear. We have state departments of education in all 50 states, and in the different territories and districts. We have school districts, schools, and teachers. All of them are somehow engaged in Holocaust education. What I would tell you, and part of my background is that I also worked at the South Carolina Department of Education as one of the 2 social studies coordinators for South Carolina. These are not as connected as we would like to envision, right? And that something coming from the state doesn't often work its way down to teachers. And likewise, what teachers are doing at the State Department, we may not know, right? So it's not as connected as we would like to envision. We also have folks like myself now in higher education, committees and councils like Mr. Ospelmeyer and the Holocaust Council, Holocaust museums and centers, and educational and professional organizations like the South Carolina Council of the Holocaust. I would say the challenge of this is that, again, it's not as connected as we would think. And so it really relies on the 2 of us wanting to work together to provide programs like this, or programs for teachers, which Mr. Ospelmeyer will discuss later on, reaching out to teachers as well. Now, I will say a challenge to it is that teachers may be interested in the professional development if it's on a work day, but may not get the day off to go to attend one of the council's sessions, right? That can be not because, oh, we don't want you to get a professional development in this area, but there are some districts where you may only have 1 professional development day per year. What do you choose to do with that one day? And that is a challenge. So I'm going to back up now and begin to look at Holocaust denial. And what we are certainly seeing in the last 5 to 6 years, probably earlier, but certainly documented in a few surveys, is an increase in anti-Semitism. The one here on the survey here depicted on the left comes from the Cantor Center at Tel Aviv University. And what they find is that there's an increase in college campus acts of anti-Semitism. Students are seeing it. And then we couple that with an Anti-Defamation League survey looking at anti-Semitism across multiple countries, including the United States. And there are a number of things here that cause alarm. There's 2 that I'm going to point to most specifically. The first is actually the top one, that 44% of respondents agree that Jews are more loyal to Israel than their own country, right? The second, 38% of respondents agreed that Jews talk too much about what happened in the Holocaust. And as Mr. Ospelmeyer mentioned, we cannot afford not to talk about the Holocaust and understand its lessons. Several years ago, the General Assembly here in South Carolina proposed defining legally what anti-Semitism would be. This passed the House. It did not pass the Senate, but well, there's Q&A later, right? Okay, but I'm going to point to this second line here, that part of our definition was to use someone else's definition. And that would be the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism from the U.S. Department of State. This is that particular document. And so the U.S. envoy, the U.S. Department of State, they have defined, or they have identified a number of things that would be considered anti-Semitic. I'm going to state a few, and then we'll look at one specifically. But this would be the dehumanization and demonization of the Jews, propagating myth and conspiracy theories that the Jews are involved in global conspiracy theories or various myths related to, I'm thinking like blood libel and so forth. A greater loyalty to Israel, blaming Israel for tensions around the world or regionally, and then Jews being monolithic, right, in their thought. And then, of course, the one that I'm interested in tonight, which is Holocaust denial as a act of anti-Semitism. UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, has a description of Holocaust denial that I like because it gives some pretty clear instances of what this would be and characteristics of it. And I've put it in bold and in bullets here. The first is it is pseudoscience. It is not, the Holocaust denial is not grounded in any type of evidence, okay? It is not scholarly, and its goal is to try to convince people that the Holocaust either did not happen or did not happen with the veracity that we understand through the historical record. It is a type of historical distortion. And I will add here that it's important that we think about the difference between revisionism, which is a legitimate academic historical exercise where each generation thinks about history in new ways and with different perspective, and historical negationism, which is a specific act to try to say something did not happen or did not happen the way it actually happened. Okay, and we could think for our history, the lost cause, right? The third is it is a symptom of extremism. Holocaust denial is a symptom of extremism and extremist thought. Eric Ward has an important take on anti-Semitism and white nationalism. Ward is an African-American intellectual and activist in the late 90s. As a black male, he, I don't want to say infiltrated, I'll say investigated white nationalist groups. And what he found was that the more anti-Semitic rhetoric he expressed, and again, he was trying to understand what makes white nationalist groups tick. The more anti-Semitic his rhetoric, the more he as a black man was embraced into that culture. And what Ward comes out of this, and Ward is now the director of the Western State Center, which does a number of work, a number of things related to issues of equity, democracy, and so forth. But he also works with schools to combat white nationalist groups trying to hook young kids, especially boys, into their organization. But what Ward points to in the first quote is that for white nationalism, which emerged in the wake of the civil rights movement, that anti-Semitism forms its theoretical core. Anti-Semitism is the theoretical core of the white nationalist movement. And more recently, here in February, he, in an article titled "Conspiracy Theories Are Killing Us," he says, Holocaust denial is an enduring strategy of the white nationalist movement. As long as the world understands the horrors of the Holocaust, it provides a moral barrier against the rehabilitation of fascism as a legitimate political ideology. White nationalist strategists understand that if they could remove that barrier, they would face less backlash to their authoritarian aims. Now, he goes on to say that if these groups, with the mountain of evidence that the Holocaust took place, can convince people that it did not happen or did not happen with the veracity that we understand it, then it makes it easier to convince people that climate data is not accurate, right? That a power grid fails in a winter storm because of green energy policies, right? So he goes on to discuss these types of things, but at the core is, how do we convince people the Holocaust did not happen? And part of it too is Holocaust deniers, if they are able to convince a group that it's worthy of debate to discuss if it took place, then they have succeeded. Which brings us back to the principal, the principal in Boca Raton, who is allowing Holocaust deniers to dictate his response in an effort to say we need to hear all sides, even those that are invalid, right? So where does that leave us today? When we think about this past Holocaust education and Holocaust denial, what we see are two things, both of them quite recent. Our colleague, Lauren Bairnsfather, who's the director of the Holocaust Center in Pittsburgh, says, I've worked in the field of Holocaust memory museums and education for half my life, and things have changed. Where once we emphasized the Jewish experience, thinking back to the 1990s, now we talk about what the Nazis and their allies and bystanders did so that we can try to understand perpetrator behavior. The the Auschwitz Memorial, and I don't know who runs their social media, but I would love to meet that person because their responses to current events are always educational. They stated recently, and this was January of this year, at Auschwitz, we see the end of a long process. It's important to remember that the Holocaust did not start from gas chambers. The hatred slowly developed from ideas, words, stereotypes, prejudice, through the legal exclusion, escalating violence, and dehumanization. Taken together, these two represent what I think is the future of Holocaust education. That we're not going to exclude or omit the Jewish experience in the camps, but it is imperative that we teach kids to understand the process that led to the Holocaust. All right? That process could be how democratic ideas and ideals and institutions were challenged. It's a process that also, in a positive, leads to a greater understanding of human rights on a global scale. But I think what we also need to think about is how do we teach kids purposefully the difference between revisionism, which is an academic exercise, and negationism, which is propaganda, right? So that they can understand and recognize Holocaust denial and combat it on their own. The other is because kids are receiving so much in social media, and my guess is we all receive some things in social media, right? We need greater media literacy in our curriculum and in our schools so that kids, as they're scrolling through their phone, they can recognize hate when they see it. And just because their friend posted it, doesn't mean their friend is right. Or retweeting or reposting, what have you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over briefly again to Mr. Osborne.
Thank you, Dr. Ergel. As you can see, we have our work cut out for us, so to speak. In terms of just a brief history of Holocaust education in our council, in particular in South Carolina specifically, before the 1990s, there was no formal entity in terms of a South Carolina Council on the Holocaust, other than individual Jewish groups and synagogues consistently promoting Holocaust education or remembrance. The person really responsible for the start of this process in many ways was Dr. Sheldon Smith, who you see here on the left. He was a Columbia College history professor, and he did something very remarkable. He had no background connection with the Holocaust. He was a history professor, but knew of it, but didn't know a lot about it necessarily. He didn't really teach about it specifically in his courses. But one time he had a student who came up to him after class, and he had briefly done a short piece of a lecture connected to the Holocaust. And she just said, I've read a little bit more about this event, and I don't really know anything about it. And he said, well, I'm not an expert in that area, but I could maybe find some books for you. And so he does do what he said. And as he started diving into a little bit of research on this, he recognized that there really needs to be more done out there. As he learned more, he became more interested. As he learned more, he also started to reach out to survivors in the local Columbia area and throughout the state. And eventually this led to him helping to start a movement to have a South Carolina Council on the Holocaust, and for that, which he chaired for many, many years. And he's often referred to as the father of Holocaust education in South Carolina because of that. So we owe a lot to Dr. Sheldon Smith. When the council was first initiated in 1989, it was an all-volunteer council. They were appointed by the governor and the legislature, still are to this day. They're small funding, which was renewed each year between 1989 and all the way up through essentially 2015. But that funding only was able to provide for typically one summer course for teachers and also small grants to a few teachers each year. In the past few years, we've received an increase in some funding, which allows us to have a staff. And by staff, I mean me, which is great, obviously. I'm happy to do so. But this particular organization has grown significantly in terms of what our intentions are for our impact and also the ideas that we have for the future, which I'll share a little bit more about. But one of the key aspects of the community's work, of the organization's work, has been to collaborate with the South Carolina Department of Education in the creation of state standards. And we were just so fortunate enough to have somebody who used to work at the Department of Education who actually dealt specifically with the creation of state standards, and Dr. Ergel. So he's going to come up and continue a little bit.
I'm back. So we were curious as we worked on the presentation, and I should have mentioned this earlier. It was in my notes, but then I went off script a little bit. A challenge with so many different entities involved in Holocaust education is it is difficult then for us to really determine what's going on out there, not only in South Carolina, but around the country. So yeah, we can't say for certain that although we have standards, that what kids are learning here in Beaufort is the same exact thing that they're learning in Greenville, which I think geographically that's the furthest, right? Maybe Spartanburg. And likewise, because it's a different state, we can't say that we could go over to Savannah and kids are getting the exact same thing either, right? Now, we could look at that and say, oh my goodness, yeah, how do we formalize this a little bit? But I think despite the problems of knowing, I don't know if we want quite something so authoritative in terms of our educational design. We tend to have, at least in South Carolina, locally controlled schools and curriculum. What you're seeing here, I have the numbers written down. What you're seeing here is a chart that shows two things. It shows the states that have mandates, legislative mandates for the teaching of the Holocaust, and then the Holocaust specifically stated in their and enumerated in their state standards. So there are 33 states that have standards with the Holocaust enumerated. Now, I'm going to fudge a little bit. So, for example, North Carolina, they refer to the Holocaust as issues of human rights during World War II. So I can extrapolate that that's what they mean by human rights. Or Oregon uses the term genocide, just outright using the term genocide. Same as Rhode Island. West Virginia, human rights violation. Wisconsin, so this is Wisconsin, right? They refer to it as the Holocaust or the Shoah, which, when I read that, I thought, you go Wisconsin, look at that, So that would be the 33 there. 18 states have legislative mandates, and so that would be a total of 39 states that have one or the other. So we could look at Rhode Island, for example, has both a mandate and it's in the standards. Illinois down here, it's a mandate, but it's not in the standards, right? So so in looking at that, let's think about what standards look like. This is an example of Illinois and explains why the Holocaust is not enumerated in the standards, because it's a skill-based standard, right? So they don't have standards that would say whatever it is about learning about the American Revolution or the Enlightenment or whatever it may be. Theirs is purely skills. So when kids go into a history class or a geography class, they would need to demonstrate the ability to gather and evaluate information from multiple sources and so forth. So that's a skills-based standard. What we also see is states, they may not always be consistent in how they're writing state standards, right? Or capturing the Holocaust. Ohio, for example, notes that students must, and I looked at high school standards, the oppression and discrimination resulted in the Armenian genocide during the First World War and the Holocaust during World War II. So they're understanding, again, that idea of a system of oppression and discrimination that leads to the Holocaust. Massachusetts is quite different. Massachusetts, we see it in two indicators in their high school standards. The same course, a U.S. History 2 course, explained the rise of fascism and the forms it took in Germany and Italy, including ideas and policies that led to the Holocaust, and then describe the Holocaust, including the roots in Christian anti-Semitism of the 19th century, ideas of race and nation, and the Nazi dehumanization and planned extermination of the Jews and persecution of LGBTQ, or LGBT, and the Gypsy Roma people. So two very different types of standards, but I think ultimately getting at the same idea is this is a system of oppression, discrimination that becomes genocide. South Carolina, we wrote a first draft of the new standards in 2017. We tweaked and based on public feedback in 2018, it went public in 2019. So the 1920 school year was a bridge year. It was to be fully implemented this year, but districts were allowed to wait a year because of the pandemic. So we wrote the Holocaust into 5 grade levels. So grades 5, 6, 8, world history, which is typically 10th grade, and US history, which is 11th grade. For purposes of brevity of the presentation, we'll look at grades 5 and 10. So a 5th grader, which we did struggle with, how early is too early, right? How young is too young? What would be appropriate? Our first decision with 5th grade is that we would not go into detail of the camps, but what kids could understand is how do you treat people fairly and what laws are fair, right? And so we looked at analyzing the cause and effect of government-sponsored policies against different groups in the United States and in Europe, and then also to understand the continuities and changes regarding international leadership, specifically in the post-war period related to displaced persons. So our focus here was really to to get kids to think, about, ideas of fairness, process, systems, human rights, without the having fifth graders think about the conditions of death camps. 10th grade, we actually put it into two different standards. So we look at the Holocaust as how we can contextualize the Holocaust within the local and global economic, political, and social developments. So here, connecting it to nationalism, fascism, and so forth. And then also to examine the Holocaust and its aftermath and providing the context of the development of our international efforts to recognize and protect human rights. So our goal here was to get kids to think about the Holocaust as a significant turning point in global history for focusing on human rights. Okay, and therefore elevating the Holocaust to a more prominent role in terms of what the previous standards were, a more prominent role when kids are studying the 20th century. So that is it in a nutshell, and we can talk more about that, but I'll turn it over to Mr. Osborne.
So the current role of the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust, as you see here with our core values and our mission statement, certainly is to focus on Holocaust education, as we think it's important to create a population with knowledge, critical thinking skills, and commitment to promoting a society free of prejudice and discrimination. So what we're talking about is not simply studying the event, but also eliciting what are the lessons that are learned from this event, and how do we apply those lessons to our lives today, to ground it in the relevance of the students' lives that they are going to lead. What we really offer is a variety of programming. In the past year or so, we've had very many opportunities to start programming on a much wider scale. Technically, we were supposed to have actually the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has a temporary exhibit. If you've ever been there in DC, they have the ground floor there. They have a temporary exhibit, usually housed there for about every 5 to 6 years. The current one is Americans in the Holocaust. There's a traveling version of that exhibit. We were fortunate enough to have applied for the opportunity to have that traveling exhibit here in South Carolina at the Richland Library in Columbia. And we were granted that opportunity. We were one of 50 locations across the US, and we were only one of 2 in the southeastern region of the United States to be awarded such an opportunity. That was supposed to happen this coming summer, but obviously the pandemic happened. So ours has been postponed to the spring of 2023. But we are very much looking forward to that. We'll have a lot of programming around that. That will be, we don't know when in 2023 outside of it being in the spring, but it'll probably be here for about 6 weeks. So that'll provide everybody in the state an opportunity to come see it if they should desire to do so. And we'll have other programming surrounding that, including some programming most likely in Charleston and Greenville to encourage people to come. Violins of Hope is kind of an international organization where they actually have violins that were saved, violins that had been played and or owned by victims of the Holocaust that were actually played in the ghettos and concentration camps. This is an organization that have found a way to preserve them and then they play them. There's going to be 4 performances around the state. This is going to happen in the spring of next year. So you'll be hearing more about that in the future, and we're helping to co-sponsor that. And there will be performances in Charleston, Myrtle Beach, Columbia, and Greenville. Also, we are working closely with the Anne Frank Center of the University of South Carolina, which is opening up very soon. And that's going to be a location that's going to house a small museum centered around the life of Anne Frank. And it's also an affiliate of the Anne Frank House in the Netherlands. So we'll be working with programming with that organization very frequently. We also have the Selden K. Smith Holocaust Education Foundation, which I believe some of the cards were passed out about that organization. That's a charitable organization here in South Carolina that we kind of work closely with, and they are dedicated to sponsoring grants for teachers and other opportunities for Holocaust education to support here in the state. And certainly they welcome all contributions at any time, really. Their big push typically is in early May with their Midlands Gives program. But their contributions actually help to fund programming throughout the state, not just in the region of the Midlands. And then, as some of you may have seen, the Holocaust Remembered supplements. We also continue to do funding that helps provide for those supplements, which are produced every April, right around this time. And Charleston has its own separate version in the Post and Courier, but we have one that runs now statewide. And so we help, I should say, educate our state in that manner as well. So those are some of our key partnerships and exhibits. But broader than that, we offer a lot of educational opportunities, especially to teachers. Teacher training is probably our main focus. That's probably where about 75% of our efforts go to every year. Developing lesson plans, literature recommendations, digital resources. We have over 30 testimonies from survivors of the Holocaust who settled in South Carolina after the war, all videotaped, all transcribed on our website. So anybody can look at that at any point in time. Some of them are well over an hour in length and very detailed. But we also have shorter clips of those same things for teacher use as well. We also have an annual student contest that we run. As far as the programs for educators specifically, we offer 2 summer institutes every year for free graduate credit. We participate in a field study to Europe, centered mainly in Poland, every other summer, and going to restart up, obviously, because the pandemic that was on hold. The first trip that's going to happen after the pandemic is going to be next summer. We are hosting also fall and spring workshops for teachers, usually a day long each, as well as many other workshops throughout the year, some virtually. And educator grants and awards are certainly something we do to try to get books in the classroom. I've had over 20 teachers supplied with grants this year that have actually gotten nonfiction memoirs and other books related to the Holocaust in the hands of over 1,500 students in South Carolina through these grants. And also we honor educators, a new program that we're having this year, awards for educators who show excellence in the teaching of the Holocaust. All of these things are located on the South Carolina website, and all you have to do is type in South Carolina Council on the Holocaust, and you can find our website very easily. Here's my contact information if anybody's interested in contacting me in the future, or you can go to the website, like I said. Also, Dr. Ergel's contact information is located there. So we're hopeful to continue expanding our opportunities. This year has been a very interesting year because of, obviously, the pandemic. We've moved everything virtually and been very successful in doing that, and we're really looking forward to being able to do more of these types of presentations, to meet face-to-face with people, especially teachers and students, but also community organizations as yourself. We're going to now open up to questions for anybody that may have a question. I think if you want to line up there. Does that sound good, Joel? And either myself or Dr. Ergel can answer any questions you may have.
Any questions?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, can we turn the lights up, please?
Yeah.
I think that might be better.
Anyone have any questions?
Oh, we got a couple.
We'll come on down. Ralph, you've got a question?
Oh, yeah.
Here you go.
Gentlemen, I think you've given an extremely fantastic overview, a macro view as opposed to a micro view. We had for many, many years survivors of the Holocaust who would go and assist local teachers or classes in local schools. Those people no longer exist simply because of age, right? What are you doing in place of those people who could come and speak to the students?
Great question. Actually, we do have a 2G and 3G program that we're helping to sponsor, where we have children and grandchildren of survivors learn how to tell the story of those survivors, and then be able to go out into the communities and the schools in particular to then tell those stories to them.
I can relate to you in that regard. I was born in Germany. I came here at age 3, perhaps 1 week before Kristallnacht. I was 10 in 1945 when the war ended. I did not feel, because of my youth, the feelings that someone who was older could feel. But what I did hear constantly was from family members of what happened to them and how many people they lost. I lost both grandparents on both sides. I lost members of my father's family. And I can just relate to the stories that I heard. But today, it doesn't have any emphasis any longer. The Holocaust Museum in Washington today doesn't necessarily speak of the Holocaust itself, but rather they speak of genocide. And they talk of genocide that exists not only in the sense of the Holocaust, but what's happening perhaps in Africa or what's happening in Myanmar or wherever it might be throughout the world, because genocide exists. What we're trying to do to the youth of our country is to make them sensitive to the ideals of what democracy truly is and what it allows and what it really looks down upon. I think that we need the personal touch more so than just some things that we can do and say, refer to it here on page this. Thank you.
That's a great point. Thank you. I'm a TP. I'm good with that.
I want to personally thank you. I think what you're doing is amazing, and I hope everybody agrees with me and just gives these gentlemen a round of applause from our hearts because of what they are doing for the Jewish people and the people that survived the Holocaust. And I have 4 grandchildren that I would not have if it wasn't for the fact that a non-Jewish woman saved my daughter-in-law's mother and her family. And she, in turn, wrote a book called Hidden from the Sun. She did not, in Belgium, she did not see the light of day until she was 5 years old. So, and I was a witness. I went to Auschwitz. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for what you are doing, because you're going to help save perhaps many future generations from the pain and suffering that the Jewish people went through just because they were Jews. Thank you.
I want to echo the thanks that you guys have been given from the audience. Clearly, as you can tell, there are many people here for whom the Holocaust is still a tangible thing. And, you know, naturally, I mean, this affects our attitudes and it affects our attitudes toward the world. I just want to mention that we had the fortune going through the local Reform Temple, Shalom. They hosted a 2-night lecture on Jewish artists of the Holocaust, of the ghettos and of the camps. And it was fascinating and it was brilliant. And I can't help thinking that there's something here that that could be of use in a program for you guys. I don't know how to facilitate this, but I'm willing to try if you see a value.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
Okay.
Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Seidman, and I'd like to tell you a story about my granddaughter who resides in Auburn, Alabama. And she is now graduating high school, and in her 2nd year in her class, one student came to her and said out loud, "Jews do not belong here." So what should she do? She went down to speak with the principal and the guidance counselors, and they had no idea what to do. She said, "I'm going to do something about this." So she formed the Shalom You All Club, inviting all students of all diversity to come and talk about who they are and their religious beliefs, etc. She also found courses for the teachers to take in the summer on diversity in Atlanta. She arranged to go to the ADL conference in Atlanta representing her high school. She is now graduating and has received an award, a national award from the museum, the World War II Museum, representing the state of Alabama for her contribution to her community. And we're so proud of her. She's graduating and she's off to college to study medicine and public health. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Al Rappaport. I'm the other co-chairman of the Shalom Club. I've got an interesting comment. You enumerated many areas in South Carolina that you will be going to, or that there are Holocaust exhibits, etc. Nothing here, nothing in this area at all. I think you should look into that and change your outlook, or whosever responsibility it is, to have something in this area, whether it's Hilton Head or Savannah. That would be appreciated.
Yes, so certainly that is definitely, we are, some of the events that I was mentioning, especially in terms of Islands of Hope, we're working with other organizations who are desiring to go to larger metropolitan areas. As far as our council is concerned, however, we represent the whole state. So we do conduct workshops throughout the state and in rural areas as well as more urban areas. So we are definitely eager to come out to those other areas as we have tonight. So I would reassure you that if there's a program to be had that you're interested in, we can try to do it. Thank you.
I have a question from YouTube.
Yes.
Do you have any information about which South Carolina school districts offer Holocaust education?
What's that? Oh, in terms of courses, not specific courses, technically there is a course on the books from the state that you could teach a course in the Holocaust, as I did, but.
The question was which school districts, are they all?
Well, all public school districts fall under the state standards, and they have to teach those standards. So that would connect to every district essentially. Yeah.
May I answer that? Yeah. I was substituting at May River High School last year, and it's part of their curriculum. Mm-hmm. So it's right here.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. Do we have any more questions or any comments? We'd like to hear from you. We want to appreciate all of you coming out here. Joel and I and the Shalom Club would like to thank everybody for showing up tonight. And it will be on, I think, taped. So if you know somebody hasn't seen it, please, we'll give the link. We'll have people listen and see what we went through tonight. But hopefully we have some more questions here.
There's one over there. There's a couple over there, I think.
Okay.
Why don't you come down here? Come down here, please. You got to come over here. We can't hear you. It's being taped.
Hi, I'm just, and by the way, I'm the daughter of a slave laborer. Not Jewish, but it fits in the same category. But I'm wondering why it's so difficult to get any type of hate crimes bill or anything like it passed in South Carolina.
I would say yes, that is a very loaded question. Yeah, I'm definitely not a politician. I know obviously there's a lot of work being done toward that right now. And I think many people in the state are hopeful that it will pass. Sometimes I think every state moves at its own pace with what it's comfortable with. I understand that that pace may be slower than what we want it to be. But the politics of each state are always kind of somewhat unique. Yeah, go ahead, yeah, please.
So this isn't necessarily in response to that question, but it's a couple thoughts that are going through my mind as I listen to the questions, which perhaps a little more directed toward Mr. Ospelmeyer. But my job is working with pre-service educators, people who want to go and teach in our high schools, primarily social studies, history, geography, economics, but I also work with some of our ELA, math, and science. And one of the things that I think is a challenge, and these are 22, 23-year-old students. It's a bit of a challenge even for them, because they see something like the TV show Friends as retro. At which point they're almost fighting words, right? I mean, so it is a challenge for them, and I find working with that particular generation, sometimes it challenges me as well. So they will sometimes want to use some of the like Call of Duty video games that show clips of like D-Day, and where you're playing like you're a D-Day an American soldier. I tell them that's hard for me to swallow, because my grandfather was a World War II veteran, and he never talked about the war, and to think about what would he imagine, how would he even think about something that was so horrific to him, and he was at D-Day, so horrific to him, turned into a video game. And yet I also understand that that's that generation's point of contact to the content. And if I can use that to help them understand a bigger issue, I do that. As a high school teacher, I noticed that as well. Somewhere around 2000, and Scott, you may have seen this too, somewhere around 2008, 9, 10, just as we were talking about the other day, there seemed to be an absence of kids who had even spoken with a World War II veteran. And I found myself talking more about my grandfather's experience because they could hear that from me, right? And that also included, he remembered seeing a car for the first time. In fact, his uncle rolled the Model T straight out of the back of the barn because he didn't know how to push the brakes. He started pulling the steering wheel, going, whoa, whoa, like it's a horse. And my grandfather, as a little kid, thought that was funny, but that was his first time ever seeing a car. So I think it's imperative for those of us who had grandparents, parents who lived through just monumental events. It also falls on us as educators to share that with kids. My grandfather's passed 11 years now, 10 years, 11 years. But I can still convey what he witnessed, at least what he saw, and shared with me, what little it was. So that kids have a better understanding of what that was like. So I think it's a call to us, and I try to impress that upon our pre-service teachers, because they have grandparents. Their grandparents' generation is the civil rights and Vietnam generation. And how are they asking their grandparents about what they lived through? So it's a cycle that continues on, and I think it's part of good teaching. But to wrap up, because I'm rambling, I think it also involves us working with educators, and I go back to that first slide, right? That we have to say, yes, we have tests and we have standards, but more important, we have kids in our classroom. And what are you going to do with those kids so that their education is relevant, meaningful, that they understand a human experience in terms of my discipline, history, right? And so I think the best, this sounds maybe bad, but I think the best that Scott and I can do is try to reach teachers at one teacher at a time or groups at a time. And if we can slowly chip away at that, then we ultimately improve our system. But unfortunately, we may not be able to solve the problem here tonight. So, yeah.
Question. What can we as individuals or as a group do to advance what you're trying to do?
That's a great question. First and foremost, I would say as individuals, even if you're looking beyond, just helping us specifically, we need to, as a people, as human beings, start to embrace a more civil discourse. I know that sounds kind of, pie in the sky sort of thing, but the reality of being able to speak to one another in a way where you can disagree and it still be okay. And you not have to be so encamped in certain areas that don't allow you to come together to voice different concerns and different opinions potentially. And for us as adults to model that for our children is very important, because then they can see and understand that they too should be not only acting that way, that should be a typical way that everybody acts. Yeah, and I think that in terms of us as a council and educators and so forth, I think every parent has a right to ask their child's teachers, what are you teaching about the Holocaust? And it doesn't have to be a gotcha sort of thing, but you have the right to ask that. And to see what they're doing in the classrooms. And if you don't feel like they're spending enough time on it, to contact the principal to ask, is there any way that maybe you need to encourage your teachers to go to professional development or get some training? We have a lot of resources out there. I have a network of over 600 teachers I can contact by email overnight, but that doesn't always mean they see it or read it. And that doesn't always mean there aren't thousands of others out there that I'm not able to connect to, that we aren't able to get in front of. And so the more we can get in front of by word of mouth and by actual programming, the more effective we'll be. Thank you. That was a great question. Go ahead.
I'll chime in just a little bit. I'm sorry. I'll chime in a little bit on that too, because working with pre-service teachers, we are very focused at USC and getting them to understand that they're not working in a school, they're working in a community, right? And that school is part of a fabric of a community. One of the challenging readings for them is an article, there's a study called What Happened on Deliberation Day. And what the researchers did is they took folks from a rather conservative suburb in Colorado and a liberal suburb. They gave them some questions to answer, and then they put them into one of three groups: an all conservative, an all liberal, or one mixed. And then they had them talk about issues of the day, right? And then they gave them the exact same questions at the end of the day. And what they found was the group that was mixed, their views became less extreme. And the views where all they were doing is talking with like-minded folks, they became more extreme. And so it's important, I think, what can we do as individuals? Number one, understand how we come to potentially just live in an echo chamber of our own ideas and why that's actually harmful to democracy, right? But also what we can do is we have to take it upon ourselves to have conversations with people of different ideas. We have to understand, how do we get out of that echo chamber that my guess is we are all very comfortable turning on our particular news channel and just sitting there, and that's how we're going to watch the news, and not really making a conscious effort to read across sources, right? And think about multiple perspectives. So I think that's one of the things that we can do as well.
I have a question, very basic.
I know what the Holocaust was very well. But what's the root of the word itself? I mean, you only hear it referenced to one thing. I mean, where does it come from? Is it a Jewish word or just what? What is it?
Yeah, it's Dr. Urgel was just mentioning burnt offering is what it means. Yeah, that's Latin roots. Latin. I think it's Latin roots. Yeah, yeah. Latin or Greek.
But that is that is why I pointed out the Wisconsin standards using the word Shoah, because there is. You know, the idea of a burnt offering is not at all what the Holocaust was. It wasn't an offering to anything or anyone, right? So the challenge, you know, the pushback there is the word is incorrect. Now it's the word that we all tend to use. It's at the front of our presentation today, but yet today we are thinking about Yom HaShoah, right? And so, you know, using the word Shoah, I think, is far more appropriate, but it's just not used as frequently in the general lexicon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Margaret Walden. I'm here today as a member of the South Carolina Council on the Holocaust. I want you to know that I was there in 1989 when it was founded. I've been a member. I was also the South Carolina consultant on social studies for a good many years. I've been an educator for 43 years until I retired, and I live here. I live in Okatee. So I've got some cards with my phone number on it. Of course, I'll go to Jeff for whatever, but if you're interested, I want to tell you that I have been here for the years that I served from 86 to 94. I served at the State Department. I came to your schools. I have a daughter teaching in your schools, grandchildren in the schools. So I know that there are programs that are happening that you may not hear about, but they are going on. Perhaps we can talk some, so when I know there's something coming, you at least know, I can let you know that there were programs that have been had, and that might make you understand what we are doing with the schools. So I've got a few cards with my name and number on them. I'll give it to you. Again, if you want to talk on the, you know, on a big level, it's Scott that you're going to go to, or I can, you know, put you in touch with if you lose his number or something else. But I did want to tell you, thank you for having us here. Again, Margaret Walden. And if I can help you in any way, please let me know.
Thank you very much. We'll conclude this program right now.
Sorry. So, any other questions? Sir, you mind stepping up? Okay.
Someone say no. So the question was, are all Holocaust deniers anti-Semites or anti-Semitic? I think was the question. So I would say yes. I would just say yes. I mean, I think if we look at the definition that we've gone through today, yeah. I mean, if you're denying it, then yes. Now, could we nuance that? You know, I think about people who do racist things, but they may not realize it's racist, right? Because it's so part of the culture that they're in. It's about educating, though, that, hey, you know, what you're doing is racist. You know, what you're doing or saying is anti-Semitic. But I would say that if folks have bought into Holocaust denial, then they are traveling in anti-Semitic circles. Do you want to?
Are there any other questions before we close out our program for the evening? Then, before we acknowledge our two terrific speakers tonight, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of our unsung heroes. the gentleman from the computer club that made the tech side of this possible tonight, Bill Altman, Brian Osgood. Thank you. And fortunately for us, they were not charging us by the hour. So we thank them for that as well. Other than that, sincerely, on behalf of Phil, myself, the Shalom Club, the board, we want to thank you on behalf of our community for taking the time to come visit us and share the work that you're doing with our community. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.